Hello, everyone, and welcome to European Council on Foreign Relations and a Rhodium event on green energy in China, how to avoid new dependencies. I'm really glad to welcome you here. My name is Jeremy Shapiro. I'm the research director at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and other than just my overall direction, I actually have very little to do with what is a really impressive report from Janka Oertel, who is our ECFR's director of China and Asia, and Charlie Vest, who is a senior analyst at the Rhodium Group. Also, an author of the report is Agatha Katz, who is busy raising a new child, and so isn't here. But the three of them have put together what I think is a really impressive and useful report, because it does something that I think is quite rare in European policy circles, which is that it actually anticipates a problem and comes up with ways to not just solve it, but actually avoid ever having the problem, which is quite refreshing. And what they're going to talk about fundamentally is how to avoid new dependencies coming from the green energy transition, particularly dependencies on China. So this session is on the record, and it's being recorded, I was told to tell you, and that the paper that I just referred to will be put into the chat so that you can download it. I would heartily recommend that you read it. We're going to start off with presentations from Janka and Charlie, and then we will hopefully have a good discussion with all of you. You can put your questions in the Q&A or the chat or whatever we call it. I'm sure at this point you know how to do that. And we'll bring the questions directly to Janka and Charlie. And if possible, we will fly some of you into the panel to give your questions directly, but I'm not exactly sure how that works. So we'll see. But anyway, to start us off, Janka, please take it away.
Thank you, Jeremy, for kicking us off. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And I'm really glad, first of all, that this collaboration with Rhodium is the second time we've done that, and it's been really fruitful before, and it was a really good collaboration here on this report as well. So this is really something to be grateful for to our partners at Rhodium Group. What we have produced is really a food for thought paper. That was the idea. It serves sort of as a starting point, not only for a debate among policymakers in Europe, but it's supposed to also foster a broader public discussion about what are pretty difficult choices ahead. In many cases, getting this green transition right will require really delicate balancing act that needs public support if it's supposed to succeed. And that's something that we can't stress enough, that none of these are optimal choices. It's just getting it to a point where you get maybe the sort of sweet spot where you can get this as good as possible under the current conditions. We are at what could be termed a kind of critical inflection point. At this very moment, Europe has to provide effective support to Ukraine in the war and build European defense capabilities. That costs money and political energy. At the same time, Europe has to drive forward the green transition and accelerate the transition away from Russian energy supplies. That costs money and political energy. And at the same time, Europe has to address the biggest overarching geopolitical challenge, the intensifying system competition with China. And this is something that creates a really problematic situation while all of this happening in light of the biggest kind of climate emergency that we find ourselves in, that necessitates an even faster transition into renewable energies. For Europe, the Chinese position to the war in Ukraine is a real game changer at the moment, and that has much broader consequences, which should not be underestimated. For the first time, China is complicit in a major security crisis in Europe. This has never been the case before, not in major economic crises. Think about the global financial crisis or the European sovereign debt crisis, or in security crises, think about Georgia, Crimea, etc. And this will have an impact on the entirety of the relationship with China, including the fight against climate change, which was already incredibly difficult to fence off from the overall dynamic before, which has now become virtually impossible. And it changes not only our political relationship, but it has an impact on investment decisions and on the risk assessment. This holds particularly true for the technologies of the future. We need a broad public debate that does not pretend that there are any kind of easy answers. So we were prompted also to think about this more by things that were being said in the German Bundestag, like renewable energies are freedom energies. That is obviously true that it enhances our independence if we're able to produce our energy here in Europe, but it's obviously not that easy. We need to be very mindful of dependencies as we currently scale up green energy investments across Europe. In our little food for thought paper, we start out with 2 examples that kind of underscore the development that we showed that we're not really properly debating this yet. So while wind energy giant Siemens Gamesa left the onshore business in China, as it is no longer interesting to participate due to a strong preference for Chinese companies in the market last August. So they left the Chinese market last August. Mingyang, Chinese wind turbine producer, has just provided the first wind turbines for the European offshore market in a wind farm project in Italy off the coast of Taranto. Another example we quote is that of the largest wind farm in Croatia, which has gone online just a few months ago and is not only equipped also with Chinese turbines, but also operated by Norinco, a Chinese industrial giant and large defense equipment producer. What these examples individually show is that these are not decisive. That doesn't mean that kind of China's turbine producers have taken over Europe, but they describe a development that we should just keep a close eye on. We've had these experiences before. I think we can discuss later in the debate how this relates to previous experiences, for example, in the 5G sector. But I think this is something where we, as Jeremy said, where we can anticipate a problem before it becomes too big to handle. The good news around this is that there is a willingness among European partners now, at this juncture, to take steps that under other circumstances would have needed decades. We're at this moment where there's a speeding up of policy decisions in light of the severe crisis that we find ourselves in. So this could serve as huge momentum to take all of the steps that are necessary. The bad news is that dependencies will continue to exist. There is no realistic option in which we can cut all of the existing dependencies at the same time. So we have to manage them, mitigate them as much as possible, but we will not eliminate them. So what we have tried to do, and Charlie will now go into the details a bit more, is try to go into a kind of broad categorization of the kind of risks, and then sketch out policy approaches that could serve as sort of guidelines for how we can approach the topics and how we can get closer to a solution. So Charlie, maybe you can take us into some of the depth of the report.
Excellent. Thank you, Janka, and thank you to ECFR for hosting us for this event. Thanks also to Agatha for being a great co-author on this report. Really delighted to be here today to present the report to you. Janka teed this up very nicely, but I just really want to make 2 points in very short remarks here with a couple of slides. The accelerating green transition, coming amid rising geopolitical risks with China, have led policymakers in the EU and elsewhere to have to consider new risks around green energy supply chains. And at the same time, these risks are going to require very challenging questions and trade-offs that policymakers will have to address. And so just in the next 10 minutes here, I wanted to tee up 5 of these risks and 5 of these challenges that policymakers should be thinking about. There are many more, but this is, as Janka mentioned, just sort of the tip of the iceberg as policymakers begin to grapple with these questions. So starting with critical minerals, this is one of the areas that a lot of people think of when they think about supply chain risks. Around rare earth minerals, rare earth metals. This is something that we've seen in the past with China restricting rare earths exports to Japan amidst geopolitical tensions in 2010. And China continues to be a major miner and exporter of rare earths like neodymium, which is a key input to certain permanent magnets that go into offshore wind turbines. And it's not just scarce minerals either, although rare earths aren't really truly rare. They're just hard to extract in a way that's environmentally and economically attractive. It's also things like lithium, which is sourced around the globe, but 60% of global lithium is processed in China and turned into batteries there. There are questions around critical components as well. The idea is that one small piece just missing from the supply chain can prevent a functional product from going off the line. The quintessential example here is, we've all seen this in the past 2 years, is semiconductors for automotive manufacturing. where delays from China caused delays in not only conventional autos, but the EV rollout around the globe. And these disruptions aren't just geopolitical, as COVID has illustrated so clearly, but the policy, I think the point is that the policy decisions that are out of the hands of European and other policymakers, like the zero COVID policy, without sufficient mitigating measures elsewhere or diversification, can delay or derail the green energy transition. A third point here is on geographic concentration risk. And this is the idea that some tech inputs or products have become almost exclusively sourced in China, and that a geopolitical risk event or some other disruption could put an entire type of energy generation supply at risk. And an example here would be solar PV ingots and wafers, 97 to 98% of which are now made in China. The fourth risk I'd like to highlight is just around know-how. And this is the idea that for a lot of these technologies, it's no longer singular technical breakthroughs that are really the key to unlocking rapid growth of these technologies and their deployment. Rather, it's around process improvements, gradual improvements in manufacturing design that come from having massive manufacturing scale. And that losing this scale puts you deeply behind and unable to produce these products in a comparable fashion or comparable quality if you lost access to their supply for some reason. A key example here would be around lithium-ion batteries, where CATL is now the world's largest EV battery maker, due in large part to access to a large protected home market that allowed it to achieve massive production scale in the last 10 years. The final risk that I'd like to highlight before I start to take us through some of the questions for policymakers is around cybersecurity risk. And this is fairly straightforward. The idea is simply that these technologies are deeply connected and digitally enabled pieces of critical infrastructure, and that makes them susceptible to cyber risks. And this was clearly illustrated by Russia's hacking of the Viasat satellite system before the invasion of Ukraine, that brought down the remote control systems on nearly 6,000 wind turbines in Germany. And so that takes me to the 5 challenges for policymakers to consider as they work to address these risks. And all of these will require policymakers to make hard choices. The first is on reassessing geopolitical risk. Ukraine has made it quite clear, or at least is no longer unthinkable, to consider that there's possible quite massive disruptions to trade with China on the horizon. Many questions now being asked about what policy responses would be in a Taiwan invasion scenario, sea disruptions to sea lanes of communication, and sanctions being among them. But even on sort of smaller, maybe geopolitical tensions that have been raised by the Lithuania case, it's no longer imagine export bans being imposed on critical goods, including energy supply chains, to gain geopolitical leverage. At the same time, fact is that it's deeply embedded technologies. We've illustrated this point in the solar industry earlier, and around 80% of lithium-ion battery takes place in China. And so it's not feasible at all to just uproot and reshore supply chains involving tens or hundreds of billion dollars of fixed asset investments. And so policymakers will have to think very carefully about what aspects of supply chains are most critical and most vulnerable, and which need action first. And also need to think creatively about what tools are available to help deal with these vulnerabilities. Reshoring is certainly a part of the picture. Friendshoring, relocating supply chains to trusted partners, is certainly another part of the picture that we'll go into in a bit. Stockpiling, there are many sort of ways that policymakers should be thinking about ways to mitigate these risks. Point 3 is about working with businesses. Policymakers will have to balance speed with disruption. Businesses are where rubber meets the road in green energy supply chains. And we're seeing this quite vividly now, or will be soon, with the US's implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which will ban imports of goods linked to Xinjiang unless importers can demonstrate that those products are free from forced labor. And that's going to be a very challenging policy environment for businesses, particularly in the solar industry, to navigate. And so the key will be, and this is easier said than done, but to have a predictable and transparent and fair process and policy environment in place so that businesses can plan well into the future with these multi-billion-dollar investments. I think we should also be thinking largely in terms of positive incentives as well, around subsidies and procurement and other sort of tools, before we reach into the bag of hammers and disincentives that to dramatically disrupt businesses and threaten the green transition. That takes me to point 4, which is that we can't allow supply chain risks to dampen momentum for the green energy transition. The urgency about that is clear to everyone on this call. And so in the short term, that means making trade-offs and accepting a bit more risk while some of our efforts to shore up supply chain security take effect. And that takes me to my last point about working with partners. This is one of those things that's easier said than done. I think in this, it's something we reach to a lot when we have discussions like these, but these are some really very challenging coordination problems. All countries want to be leaders in these technologies, and everybody sees the economic benefits associated with having strong domestic players in each of these green energy sectors. And so it's going to be a difficult thing to figure out how to tailor and coordinate our policies in a way that avoids races to the bottom and unhealthy competition. A few ideas that came up in the course of the discussion with industry players and with policymakers as we were working on this paper: having open procurement rules among trusted partners. This is something where we're already beginning to see friction around Made in America rules for electric vehicles. As a friction point in these discussions. The second is making subsidies programs conducive to supply chain diversification among trusted partners. Forums like the EU and the US TTC are going to play a really important role in coordinating around these challenges. And so I'll close out and hand back to Janka with just one final point, as just to say that it's clear to all of us that we need to accelerate the green transition, but it's also clear that if you think to a future where green energy is really a dominant component of our critical infrastructure, we do need to grapple with these hard questions and think about them carefully. So with that, I'll hand it back to Janka.
Thank you, Charlie. And I just wanted to make a little bit of a kind of round us off with a little bit of what is going on at the moment, and just before we kind of go into the discussion, say that it's good to see that the EU is not losing sight at the moment, seemingly, of the other dimensions that are happening kind of geopolitically, aside from the war in Ukraine. I think that some of the recent visits and trips and meetings that we've seen are pointing in a direction that there is a kind of clarity of acceptance that these risks exist and that we need to do something about them. Thinking about Ursula von der Leyen's visit to India and the stress there on the cooperation in terms of solar energy. The EU-Japan summit just today, stressing also the EU-Japan Green Alliance. We've had the German government consultations with India, where this was a major point as well. We had Olaf Scholz in Japan, where this was a major issue in terms of hydrogen cooperation, etc. We are aware, I think, in Europe that we need global coalitions to tackle the challenges ahead. But I think, as Charlie has pointed out, we will have to navigate the fact that we're still competitors in this issue, in this area as well. And now what we have to decide is whether the challenge that we're facing is so big that we need to put some of the competitive dimensions in our kind of friendly relations aside and work together on research and development, etc. Or whether the challenge is not big enough yet and whether we can still afford to compete with each other around all of these issues. The two examples, I think, that show how the EU is able to find formats in which this coordination at least can be possible is, I think, the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, where the Climate and Clean Tech Working Group is a really good place for this. And I just wanted to kind of end with a little note in saying that when designing the EU-India Trade and Technology Council that has just been cooked up and is sort of still in its emerging phase and how it's going to be designed, this should be a high priority to focus on how to coordinate with a market of that size that can create scale, where some of these kind of diversification problems that we're looking at can be mitigated, where this is precisely the right avenue for doing that. And I think it would be really good to explore these opportunities in these areas more, and draw the deep connection that we find between what we're seeing happening right now in Europe and what we will see in the future, because these risks, as we said, are clearly interconnected. So this idea that policymakers now could still say, well, we have a Ukraine problem right now, so we'll deal with the China challenge later. I think the argument we would like to make is those two belong together in the conversation that we're having right now.
Thanks, Janka. So I want to, at this point, open the field up for questions. I believe you can enter questions through the Q&A function on within Zoom. I would encourage you to do that, because if I have to ask all the questions, it will be uncomfortable for everyone. So I think, to sort of start us off, I think we're flying in a Stephen Everts to ask the first question. And I think it was quite interesting in listening to your very comprehensive presentations that you have put up a very demanding set of requirements for policymakers. I almost feel as if, and I know you said this is sort of opening part of the conversation, but we've framed some issues. We've admitted that they're difficult, but we haven't provided a lot of the answers that need to be provided over the next few years. So I'm wondering what Stephen Everett sees in terms of the answers that they're providing within this framework, and what else he needs us to be doing in the next paper.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Colleagues, very happy to join you here for this discussion. First off, I like very much the initial framing, Jeremy, that you gave, and the tonality of this paper, which is it's really a food for thought paper, and it doesn't present sort of easy fixes. Sometimes in think tank land, that's what you get. There's a definition of the problem, and here's the list of things to do. But what this paper suggests, that these are tough problems, right? And there are dilemmas and there are trade-offs, and I think that's the right way to go about it. First off, I think people here in Brussels are very aware that we don't just have a Russia war against Ukraine that we need to work on, that anything we do in the context of solving that enormous problem has to be done in a way that avoids further problems down the road. So where Janka left off, I think that's very much the mindset that people have, and the kinds of proposals that are now being cooked up under the Repower EU, how to get us off the energy dependency and the fossil fuel imports from Russia, should be done in a way that enhances overall the resilience and the strategic freedoms and security of the EU overall. That's very much the mindset. So in that context, 2 comments on your paper. I think it's right to bring all our attention to these problems of, supply chain risks and management, and right-sizing our China exposure overall, and what have you. But this is a conversation we need to very much have also with the people who take these decisions, on these investment decisions, on these planning decisions, on these university partnerships. This is an ECFR meeting, and it's fantastic that foreign policy types are discussing it and raising awareness and sharing our perspectives. And I know you're doing it, but this is very much also a debate that we need to have at home in the domestic policy choices and trade-offs, and where budgets are being drawn up and investment decisions are made. That's where people need to be aware of your very, very pertinent reflections. That's the first point. Second point, but foreign policy types can do things, and we should do things, and that's primarily the working with partners component. And indeed, this is a fast growing field, right? It's the US TTC, there's a lot of excitement around it. Now it needs to deliver. It's not just having these meetings and these working groups, but it really needs to deliver. That's easier said than done because our policy systems are quite different across the Atlantic, but okay. I think there's real political interest. It's going so well that we're now also going with India on this, and there's a longer work going on with Japan. In all of this, I would like us also to include not just how we cooperate with these advanced democracies and friend shoring and these kinds of things, but also hopefully have a little bit of space and bandwidth for working with Latin America or Africa. Africa is a gigantic open field in terms of which standards and choices it will adopt on these emerging technologies. There's a partnership component. We can do a lot of the things and diversification away from Chinese risks, but it's also a question of which standards African partners themselves will adopt, and they're exposed to choices between European and African and other options. The saying is that whenever the Chinese come to visit, we get a hospital, or when we get European visitors, we get a lecture. And the key bit here is the financing component. And with the Global Gateway, I think we have more opportunities. 150 billion. It's not small beer. So if you combine the standard setting with the financing, maybe we can help also other partners, not only ourselves and our democratic art, but also others around the world deal with this problem. Anyway, great paper, and let's continue this conversation. Thanks. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Stephen. That was very helpful. I think the main comments are bring in business and think about new types of partners. Janka or Charlie, did you want to comment on that and respond to it?
On the first point, I mean, both comments very well taken. It's interesting. I had conversations with folks in the research and development space for lithium-ion batteries at UC San Diego. This was maybe 3 years ago that I was talking with folks on this. And one of the challenges that they faced was that they are doing cutting edge research on lithium-ion batteries, some of the best research done in the space. But without a strong domestic industry to sort of focus those investments, they were put into a dilemma where, okay, there are export controls on certain kinds of very high capacity new battery technologies that prevent them from sharing that with Chinese counterparts who are doing the manufacturing and the commercialization. And if you put barriers that are too stringent, even without sort of expecting the long-term impacts of it, you could really damage this very healthy R&D ecosystem that currently exists today, in the US and Europe. And so it is very important that we bring in both business perspectives and folks from the scientific community who work on these issues to really see what the issues are before we dive in with policy measures that could be needlessly destructive. So yeah, thank you for your comments.
And I think one of the topics that we were discussing when we're doing interviews for the report was also that the talent question is one that is going to be really big. It's one thing to stand there as a policymaker in Europe and say, we'll just reshore this, we'll just bring all this technology back home. But you need to have people who are actually capable of producing what you want to produce. And there's going to be real problems in terms of shortages of skilled laborers for working on this. So this is a comprehensive task. And I think this is where, Stephen, I agree very much with you that this is mainly also domestic communications. And I think this is what this is also targeted at, to say, we need to start this conversation among those people that have not had the conversation yet, and where this is going to have a significant impact on their life, on their kind of wallets, on the structures. This is not only a kind of industrial policy debate and a restructuring of the economy debate, but it's also a migration question. Becomes a kind of skilled migration question. It becomes a kind of what kind of research environments can we create? And it can go as far as to say, we need to think about joint industrial policies between serious economies that want to work together in a way that we've never done it before. And I think that's kind of where the immediate feeling of working with partners to a degree, and not so far as we can, even TTC is still complicated and it's still difficult to align out. That's what I meant in terms of saying we have to understand, or we have to define for ourselves. Policymakers have to define how big the problem is that we're seeing. I think think tankers can say we think it's pretty big, but I think it's policymakers that have to communicate that, how big the problem is and what the right measures are to be taken in that regard. We can basically just offer a few choices. So thank you very much for your comments, and maybe we can just continue the conversation about difficult choices.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I guess that's why the policymakers make the big money. There's a few questions in the chat, which we'll get to now. I think I'd still take this moment to encourage people to ask more, because I think we probably have some more time. The first question, you'll have to excuse my pronunciation, but I think it's from Timo Verhage, is a question that also sort of occurred to me, and it even occurred from a bit from the last thing that Janka just said. He wants to understand a bit more about this right sizing of Chinese exposure, what you referred to as in parts as onshoring and friendshoring and shoring, I guess. How does this actually work? It occurred to me that this is a level of industrial policy that we've never really attempted before, and I'm not clear that it's all well and good to say we need to do it, but it's not really clear to me that either Europe or the United States has the sort of technical or governmental capacity to do it. And so I know that you don't have a full answer to this question, but I think it would be great to get a little bit more insight into how we would do this, and maybe particularly what kind of capacities we would need to put into the government to be able to do something that it's really never done before.
If I may just take that really quickly for like a quick thought on that. I think what we're seeing in Germany right now with regard to the response to the Ukraine crisis and the war in Ukraine and our questions about energy security is a good example of what it really takes is political will in the first instance. A lot of the things are actually possible. All of those things that seem almost technically impossible, all of a sudden can be sped up, can be enforced, can be kind of brought through the system. A lot of good ideas are there. So I think the first step is to say all of these decisions are not impossible. They are difficult, but they're possible if there is enough political will to push them through. Then there's a timeline question. What are the most urgent things to do? What are the most urgent things to avoid? I think our kind of wind turbine examples that were kind of very much targeted at that, say we don't actually need to make these decisions. These are decisions that can be avoided, where we can just kind of create a market in Europe that is kind of preferential then for European technologies. And the other element is to say where are the most high-tech developments that we really need to put our emphasis on, and where can we steer money? We have one of the points that we raise in the paper is the creating the level playing field in the home market. And I think that's a really important point where we are, it's very difficult for European industry and for European players on global markets and competing with Chinese industries, because there is not a level playing field in many instances, and we will not be able to immediately tackle that. But what we actually can tackle is our home market. And it's an attractive and a growing market. And one of the things that also in the interviews that we've done for this report came out was the cake is going to grow so much that there's a lot of slices. This is not just that we may kind of be kicked out of the Chinese market and there's not enough market left. Because this sector is such a growth business, this is going to be really hard even for European companies to be able to deliver on all of this. So we can use that momentum to build also the ecosystems that allow for these developments to take place, but that will require universities and kind of cities and universities working together to create these kind of infrastructures and ecosystems across borders, across regions in Europe, with a lot of political initiative behind it, to say this is where we want to go. And this doesn't only need to be in Europe. I think that's also a point that we try to make, say this needs to have a good division of labor between the different players that are kind of in that friendshoring community.
Thanks. I think there's a Charlie, did you want to answer that question too?
Yeah, I'll just add sort of 2 points here. One, first on the government capacity and the question about how well equipped we are to respond to this challenge. I mean, I think one of the first steps that needs to take place, and this is already beginning to happen, is having comprehensive supply chain mapping of these technologies and understanding really where the vulnerabilities are. The EU to do this. The US has just in the last couple of months released 12 or so just excellent, very comprehensive papers on rare earths from magnets, electrolyzers, or lithium ions, looking at these technologies that we're interested to begin the process anyway of thinking about where we should be focusing our efforts. And so that's an encouraging thought to know that there's already a lot of talent at the Department of Energy and other places thinking about these questions in a serious way. I think there is a lot of political momentum, again, speaking from the U.S. perspective here, about making real progress. And just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration announced $3.1 billion going towards domestic EV battery manufacturing, which is not all we'll need by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a lot of need, and I think there's a lot of appetite for really scaling this up. And the last point is, in terms of right sizing the relationship with China on these things, it really doesn't mean closing the door all the way. Really, I think we can continue to welcome investment from China in a lot of places. I mean, I certainly think that CATL's proposed battery plant in Germany, and proposed, I think it's under construction, is a positive step, right? We're talking about moving production regionally around in a way that these are German engineers who are working on developing these batteries and doing this stuff. So it really doesn't mean closing the door all the way. It just means thinking about these questions in a critical way. But it's an
so there's now quite a few questions in the chat, but one of them actually follows up a little bit directly on what we were just talking about. So I'll go there. Johannes Meyer asks about the question of cost in all of this. He points out that reducing the fragility of our supply chains almost definitionally implies higher costs, because of course that's why you have the supply chains as they are in the first place. Cost has been the main driver of the besides Chinese industrial policy, of the nature of the supply chains. So have you or anybody else started to quantify these costs, and can you give us any sense of what they might be?
I think before Charlie hops into this as well, I can give you a good answer, but the quantification is really difficult at the moment, because it's like the ground is moving underneath our feet. The costs are also defined by the risk factor that happens through the keeping things the way they are. And because we have the dual situation at the moment, particularly within the Chinese market, of lockdown policies, COVID-0 policies, and kind of transposition on the war in Ukraine, and the imminent threat of sanctions, etc., the risk assessment for companies is already shifting right now. And that will automatically have an impact on the kind of cost. So as an example, if we talk particularly about critical minerals and rare earth extraction, whereas this makes sense when you buy from somewhere where the costs are low, where exploitation in other areas just seems too costly and just not economically feasible. If the risk level in the place where you have purchased at a low cost goes up significantly, then an economically less attractive location for extracting those minerals becomes more attractive. So I think we are at the moment in a situation where it's really hard to directly quantify that, but where is a good moment to have a very direct conversation with the companies that are involved right now, talk about their needs, talk about what exactly it is that that they require, and where one can put the necessary mechanisms in play that will make it easier for these companies to make choices that are slightly less risky, and that are more resilient against kind of future shocks in terms of the relationship with China particularly.
Okay, Charlie, do you have anything to add to that?
Not much. Just to say that the question is an important one. I mean, in the U.S. right now, we're following through on ripping and replacing ZTE and Huawei equipment from local telecoms, and the amount of money that was budgeted to carry out that effort is about a third now of what's expected now to actually to make it happen. So I think there are tremendous costs involved with these things, and we do have to think about them hard. But the opportunity costs too of the not insignificant what ifs of supply chain disruptions on this scale, have to be factored into the net present value of those decisions.
Plus the geopolitical independence, which is something that money cannot buy. But it strikes me that in some sense, the purpose of this paper is to get lower costs through avoiding the type of 5G situation you're talking about, where you have to buy the equipment twice and you have to completely reconfigure your supply chain. The effort here is to create resilient supply chains from the beginning, more or less, so that we don't have to do that kind of thing. But I still imagine it will be costly. There is a couple of questions in the chat around the question of perception on this issue from Roberto Lacal Arantegui. I got that one badly. And from Spain. He notes that citizens don't really seem aware of the dangers of economic relations with countries like China, and it's definitely not on the media agenda, at least in Spain, which is, I think that's true in Germany, I can say at least, which is, basically occupied by the war and a few other things. And it feels as if the role of Europe and Europeans in the world is really only an issue for Brussels. And this paper did seem to sort of speak mostly to Brussels or somewhat to governments. So this is, I think, he says this is a bit worrying, and I guess I would agree. And in a related way, Alan Crawford asked about the recognition about this issue among policymakers, and specifically the threat, or in some cases the reality of a dependence on China for aspects of green tech. And I guess he's particularly asking about Germany and Robert Habeck and the economics ministry, whether you could assess whether they are aware of this and responding to that threat. I think I know the answer to that last question, but I think it would be good if you could sort of take on perception on both of these levels and talk about both the degree to which it already exists at the level of the public opinion and at the level of the governments, but also to the extent that it needs to be improved, what could be done about that. Who wants to start on that? Easy question.
Should I, Charlie? Because it's not a European question. I'll start and then you can go on. So I think we have to give a bit of credit to the German political debate here, because the conversation is actually changing quite a bit. And I did find it quite striking that in all of the conversations we had about kind of the new scenario that we find ourselves in our relationship with Russia, that there was a clear link established to the relationship with China. And that was kind of thought through as the dependencies now on Russia. China could be next. What do we do about that? It was both the governing parties, also the opposition leaders now coming out with kind of statements around that. I do think that particularly in the ministries, this is being thought through, whether it is being thought through to the detail that we need, and whether it's being thought through kind of as fundamentally as we would want to. I mean, this is precisely the point where we wrote a paper about it. We would like to draw a little more attention to it, but I think there is a general level of awareness there that wasn't there before the invasion of Ukraine. And so in a way, this is kind of a window of opportunity to stress these debates and to move them forward and to think them through slightly more against the background of a real threat scenario that we're facing right now. And that is something that not in all of the European member states is at that same level. So that's what I meant in terms of connecting the conversations, to connect the conversation about China, not detach it from the current situation that we're having, is I think the key task that needs to be done to also bring the broader public up to these debates. So if we're saying it's not a media debate in Spain, it's not a big conversation in many European countries, what the relationship with China looks like in the future, then this is also kind of the job of those kind of making the news happening and talking about it, to just really connect the conversations about this and have a very comprehensive debate about how Europe will be securing its critical infrastructure in the future. And I think we had a good start with the 5G conversation. So this is basically a continuation of that. And the good thing is we had some practice with the 5G conversation as well. And so we can use that practice now to kind of carry on the debate in a slightly more sophisticated fashion.
We've learned what not to do. Charlie, do you want to maybe investigate that question a little bit in the U.S. context? Because I think it's relevant to the question about both governmental and public opinion recognition of this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that question's a little bit more European specific. I wouldn't want to opine too much, but yeah, what aspects in particular, Jeremy, did you want to
I just meant I meant maybe you could take it on in the U.S. context, the degree, asking the same question in the U.S. Do you feel as if there is sufficient awareness of this at the public and governmental levels in the U.S.? And if not, what should be done about it?
Okay, yeah. At the public level, I'm not sure there's a ton of awareness on this question. I mean, there is certainly from COVID, a real toxicity to the debate on, toxicity, awareness of the debate around supply chain vulnerabilities relating to China, and certainly just a deep level of mistrust right now between the United States and China in a way that makes the political conversation very toxic. At the same time, conversations that we've had with folks in and around government, I think there is an appetite to have this conversation and awareness about the nuances of these issues and the need to think critically about what to tackle first, what's possible in the short term and what's not. I think there is, particularly in this administration, a lot of folks who are well equipped to grapple with these questions.
Okay, a question I think mostly to you, Janka, that comes from the chat by Akshay, which is asking really about whether Japan and India represent a special opportunity to have a green relationship, but I guess he also means to sort of mitigate some of these supply chain dependency risks coming from China. You mentioned that a little bit in the presentation, but maybe you could elaborate on it a bit.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that this factor, which has not been a huge point of discussion years ago in the last few years in our relationship, has now kind of reached the top-notch level. The fact that President of the Commission goes to India and talks about solar almost exclusively, and about global gateway as an avenue for enhancing infrastructure cooperation, and about joint investment and about technology, and these are all very recent developments that we're seeing. This embrace of India as a partner, I think, has to be taken with a pinch of salt. This is not certainly going to be easy for both sides, I think, because there are a lot of obstacles to cooperation in this field. But I think the window of opportunity again here is that there is an awareness on both sides that there is a necessity for working closer together in these fields to be able to achieve both goals, to have greater resilience, but to also have to push forward the green transition. Japan is specifically relevant, I think, for Europe on the question of hydrogen. This is going to be the main topic of conversations there, and is going to be the kind of key issue in which one works together around these questions. But the fact that these, I think sometimes this is being taken for granted, but the fact that Olaf Scholz, under the conditions that we have currently in Europe, with a huge public discussion about what the government should and shouldn't be doing, it takes the time to go to Japan, it takes the time to have government consultations with India, is a good indicator of how important these relationships are going to be in the future, and how this is seen in a comprehensive fashion as this is part of the solution already. And I think no one is naive about we'll just replace the Indian market, the Chinese market with the Indian market, and then all our problems are going to be solved. I don't think that naivete exists, but there is a greater acceptance now of the diversification that is necessary. And by just putting some political emphasis on that, that already creates a different kind of business environment as well.
Do you have anything to add to that, Charlie?
I mean, just to highlight Janka's point about the cooperation on hydrogen and batteries as well. I mean, cooperation with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, on all different links in the battery supply chain. And that's just going to be a really important part of any successful strategy when thinking about these technologies.
Yeah, I think one of the things that both of your answers emphasize, though, is that there isn't going to be sort of one one shot for this. There isn't going to be one replacement for China. There isn't going to be one country that's going to answer all of the bells. It's going to have to be a quite diversified and global system, which is more aware of geopolitical risk than has had to have been in the past, but will still be quite diverse and global, I suppose. It seems like all of the best questions are coming from people with very difficult names. So I'll try this one. Agnieszka Liszka Dobrowolska is asking a similar question to what we just answered, but asking it in a very different and I think interesting way. She's wondering whether there are comparative advantages for countries in Eastern Europe for this nearshoring of renewable production assembly, or just, I guess, green transition in general. And I think that sort of poses the larger question of which are the countries that will most benefit from this, and where are the comparative advantages? And I think it would be good if you could particularly answer that in regard to Eastern Europe, if you know. Who wants to take that on?
I can if you want to. So
please.
This is precisely the kind of conversation that are to be had, is where are the areas where this makes total sense in Europe to invest in these capacities. The problem that I think we will see in Eastern Europe is not generally that this is not an attractive destination for these kinds of investments and that you couldn't create the conditions there. It's going to be in the end also again a question of, do we have the necessary amount of skilled labor that is needed there, where we see we have large amounts of empty jobs or free jobs, vacant jobs at the moment in countries like Poland at the moment, where it's actually hard to get enough staff for this. So I think whereas there is an understanding that this would be strategically clever and useful to focus European energy on building these capacities in specific parts of Europe, this is in the end going to be a commercial decision for companies as well. They're going to go where the best conditions are, for the development of their business, and that will require kind of governments to make incentives. It will require kind of the governments to coordinate in making incentives, and the EU level to provide incentives. I am a bit afraid that, and I'm saying that as a German, in the end, Germany always somehow benefits from this stuff. And maybe we can avoid that in this instance. But I think this is about really which of the governments in Europe is willing to also think this through properly, make credible offers. As we had discussed before, what companies are benefiting from in the Chinese ecosystem is more than the Chinese market. It is a very, very sophisticated version of the ecosystem for the production, including the sourcing, including the research and development environment that they find. Replicating that is not going to be very easy. It's going to be very costly. So how can we best work together on that is, I think, the big question.
And just one sort of very concrete example. I think it was last summer, the EU and Ukraine signed a strategic partnership on critical minerals, including rare earths. And so there is a lot of opportunity for partnership on these things, and that redounds to the benefit of all countries in Europe. So yeah, absolutely.
I think there are two related questions in the chat that about the specific that sort of build on what you just said about specific companies, and I think it gets at some of the ways in which some of the dangers in terms of that industrial policy can create for companies, which is, I think, something we really have to sort of take into account. Nathan Chile asks if there are examples of specific EU companies and the different perspectives that they have on the issue. And I think what he's trying to get at is the difference between large companies and startups. That large companies tend to have the capacity in industrial policy situations and subsidy situations to capture the policy, distort the policy, and be able to take more advantage in ways that might disadvantage more dynamic startups, more innovative startups, which are, of course, very necessary for the innovation we need in the green transition. So I think it would be good if you could talk about the risks that this might involve for them and how you might mitigate that. And I think Barbara Pongratz asks a sort of related, but maybe almost opposite question, because she notes a specific company, Nordex, that manufactured wind rotor blades, that just had to close its doors in Germany because it was losing out to Chinese competition, and because of the early phase out of subsidies, which basically sort of implies the other risk that the subsidies can create a certain dependency, can distort your capacity to understand whether you're actually competitive, and are tough to make time consistent. So it would be good if you could sort of just talk about both of these types of risks to companies that come from these efforts to sort of have regulatory control of the supply chains.
Maybe I'll just say a couple words at the top and then pass it to you. I think one of the interesting things around the debate about industrial policy, particularly in the last 5-ish years, I mean, so much of it has been driven by China, for one. And so it's natural that people sort of look to China as an example of what industrial policy looks like. I think that's a sort of a dangerous approach to take. The question, I'll preface this by saying that the questions are excellent, that thinking about like the ins and outs of industrial policy and what the risks are and what the trade-offs are with it are exactly the sort of conversation we need to be having. But in the Chinese industrial policy context, it's been tremendously expensive. The semiconductors industry has been a key example of that. The lithium ion battery manufacturing sector has been, and the EV sector more broadly, has been a big part of that. Lots of wasteful spending, a lot of industrial overcapacity that has spilled over into global markets in a way that's been a challenge for solar industry and for others to deal with. And so we do need to be thinking, carefully about what sort of tools we use to, it's going to be a market distortion. That's the nature of the thing, but in a way that is technologically neutral and is open to trusted partners, and moves towards a more sustainable large-scale deployment of these technologies. But yeah, these are excellent questions. Janka, I'm not sure if you had anything to add.
Before you do, Janka, I want to sort of add a provocation on the same topic, really, because we're running out of time, so this will probably be the last question. But Bruno Marcos sort of says that, this all sounds very green and noble, but it also sounds like you're trying to make the US and Europe a lot more like China, and that some of these policies seem quite protectionist, which is a sort of starker way of saying the same thing. So I'm wondering if you can sort of try to address that both in its sort of company level and in this sort of theoretical level of are we
becoming, I couldn't hear you because you were breaking up, but I think you were
becoming
saying,
more like China.
Is that what we China? Yes. So I think I would like to zoom it out a little bit. And that is the kind of, what are we actually dealing with? Are we dealing with a market problem, or are we dealing with a problem that is a state-generated problem? And what we are actually dealing with at the moment is with China is an economy that we thought, the entry of the WTO in 2001, was going to become more market-oriented, was going to become more open, was going to become more integrated in international markets. And what we're seeing is the development that is the opposite of that. And we see a trend that is from the Chinese economy to become more decoupled from the world, to become more inward-looking, to become less open in various sectors, and to build national champions and to capture global markets. And to do this with measures that are not necessarily market measures. And this is whether we like that or not like that, whether we think that is conform with the WTO or not conform with the WTO, we have to deal with it. It is a challenge to our companies that is a structural challenge to our companies. And this is one of the takeaways for me from the 5G conversation, is that a lot of the conversation in Europe centered around, well, maybe our players are just not competitive enough. Maybe our players have not invested enough in research and development. Maybe our players are just not good enough at this. Whereas our companies have actually been dealing with a structural challenge at the global level that was unable to be handled at the company level. That was something that actually needed a degree of state intervention to be dealt with. So I think what we are trying to say is we will have to deal with this in our home market, we can deal with this with measures that apply for all. And at the global market, we need to make sure that we strengthen our players so that they can compete. And this is, you can say we have to become more like China, but you can also say we have to work with as many others as possible to create a framework within which we can apply the rules that we think should be applied, by lessening our dependence on China, by lessening our exposure to the Chinese market, so that we set the standards for how this is supposed to look like. And yes, that is a different kind of globalization, and it's a different kind of global economy that we're looking for, because what we're looking at right now isn't really working. And I think that's I think it's a good argument to say, but this is the end of kind of globalization as we know it. It's a new phase of defining the rules for the future of what this should look like.
So it's not necessarily becoming more like China, but it is certainly responding to China. I think we've reached the end of the time. There are a lot more questions in the chat, and I apologize to the ones that we didn't get to, but we'll record them and I'll make Janka answer them over the next several weeks. But most of all, of course, I want to thank Janka and Charlie for really excellent presentations, and I suppose most specifically for really thinking about this issue proactively and tackling some really hard questions and setting us on the right road. So we will, we will anxiously await your next paper, because there's clearly a lot left to do. Thank you, and thank everybody for participating. Have a good day.
Thank you, Jeremy. And let me just make a little shout out at the end to Agatha Katz, our co-author, who we're missing on this panel, but we'll hope to have with us next time again when we're working together.